Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
My guest for this episode of the Leo Training Podcast is Jim Joy. Jim Joy is coached at the University of Western Ontario, M.I.T, Yale University, and Wesleyan University, as well as Hobart and William Smith colleges. Jim also helped start Craftsbury Sculling Camp, the first rowing camp of its kind in North America. Jim founded and has run the Joy of Sculling Coaching Conference for more than 25 years. This conference has drawn more than 5,000 coaches from youth programs, clubs, schools, colleges, and national teams across the country and is focused on education and athletic development in the sport of rowing. And most recently, Jim was awarded the 2017 U.S. Rowing Medal of Honor Award. Jim is well known for his holistic and technical approach to a cyclical, non-fragmented rowing stroke, where there is a strong bond between body, shell, and water, creating a state of flow within an integrated whole. It is this approach to the rowing stroke where our interview will focus its attention toward. So here are 3 things that you'll learn from Jim Joy in this interview. 1. What are the primers for visualization? 2. Why a complete training program should also include time for mental training. And 3. Jim will provide some tools on how you can find flow during your own rowing. So without further ado, let's roll to this brand new episode with Jim Joy. Jim, thanks so much for coming on to the Leo Training Podcast. I'm so excited to have you on here. It's a real honor for me, and I'm looking forward to sitting down and discussing with you the mental side of the sport, and in particular, we're going to discuss getting into a flow state.
Good. So I came to rowing at age 15. The Canadian Henley introduced a new class, 135 pound class in 1951. Prior to that time, I had taken part in 9 sports. I had 2 Ontario championships behind me in hockey and lacrosse. I had played lacrosse on 2 Indian reservations as a kid, the Tuscaroras in Upper New York State and the Mohawks in Brantford, Ontario. I was on 119 pounds, so I came and I started rowing. I just used my athletic ability from all these different sports that I had played up until that time. I was always outdoors. I was just playing all the time. And school was really secondary. Academic education was secondary to me. As a small athlete, I think it was a fairly young age, I started to explore myself. I started to think about and explore the possibility of fluid motion. We called it fluidity in those times, but it was the same thing. It was flow. And so I started to explore this, and because I had to have something else, because I didn't have the size, so I had to have something else in my bag that I was carrying. So I started to look at athletes, and 2 that stuck out at the time were Joe Kroll and Royal Copeland from the Toronto Argonauts football team. They became important role models, along with Gordie Howe who had a beautiful stride, that he developed on the rivers of Saskatchewan. Just was a I was looking for smooth athletes and was aware of it. That the smoothness was something that I really needed to explore and incorporate into my own performance. Then it's a big jump. When I went into college, I played a couple of years of football, and then because of concussions, they said you're going to coach, and I then was recruited to wrestle. And the way I approached it, I just learned a takedown, an escape, and a pin. I just did 3 things, and I learned them well, and then tried to incorporate this whole business of flow into my movements. I would go from one movement to the next, and developed and I'm still critical, I think, of the wrestling today. I think I developed the ability, I transferred from the sculling, I transferred my sense of balance from the sculling to the wrestling. So I knew how to position myself when I was holding someone down. I knew how to position myself back towards their legs. I worked on their legs. I didn't work up because I thought it was too risky, that people escaped too easily. And when you held on to someone's legs, they couldn't move. They couldn't get away. So the wrestling was an important part of my growth as an athlete. I wrestled 1 year out of college. I wrestled for Niagara Falls, New York, YMCA, and we had a number of former intercollegiate athletes. It was a very strong team, and that was a very good experience. I continued to scull in the summertime, and after about 6 years of rowing and having different coaches, I tried to find someone to teach me sculling, and the head coach of the St. Catharines Rowing Club suggested, well, there's only one man in this area that's good, and that was Bob Fitzpatrick. Bob Fitzpatrick came from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. He had sculled himself on the Halifax Basin. He had been taught by champions. He worked with champions. He studied the sport. And when I came to him, he was 65 years old and had a heart condition. So that relationship lasted 15 years until his death in 1971. And he was a smooth movement coach. I'd characterize him that fashion. He tried to get the skill across so that you were rowing smoothly. His model was Bob Pierce. Bob Pierce was voted the best athlete of Australia's bicentennial year in 1970. So all the great athletes that Australia had, they reached back to Bob Pierce, who had rowed in the 1920s and 1930s. He had rowed professionally and never had been defeated. So as a scholar, I became sort of a pocket Pierce. I mean, that's my technique looked like Pierce. And it was very efficient. And Bob Fitzpatrick basically put together the teachings of Steve Fairburn from Great Britain, the old orthodoxy from Great Britain, and Bob Pierce. He molded this stroke, and it lasted, well, it's still there today. I mean, if people want to take my teachings, it's still there and still very effective for getting the shell to run evenly, run smoothly. We see today a lot of stopping in the motion and a lot of power application, but the stroke that Fitzpatrick came up with was very, very effective. The shell run. So basically the person in the shell knew how to move boats, really knew how to move boats, and not just power, which we're seeing a lot today, which consequently you see a lot of porpoising of the shell, a lot of stopping of the shell. And this is not what Fitzpatrick was trying to get across. So when I came into my coaching, which was in the 1960s, I wanted to carry these concepts into the coaching, and I think I did fairly effectively. My presentation at Saratoga basically was encouraging the coach to be a detailed coach. Look at the details. Look at what the knees are doing. Look at what the elbows and the shoulders, the head, the legs are doing. Look how they're positioned. They should be over the keel, but make sure you're coaching for details. And what you're trying to do in an 8 is get 8 people to do it. About 2 weeks ago, I was in New York for this Golden Oars event by U.S. Rowing, and a number of my athletes were there, and a number of my women that I had coached at this little school, William Smith, were there. And I asked them pointedly, how do you think you achieve 10 to 12 flow experiences in the first 6 years of the school having a varsity status? 10 to 12. They came, that's a lot in 6 years, 10 to 12. They came to me. And a lot of them, there was one in particular at Lake Quinsigamon in the championship where the second place finishers, University of Virginia, they took a woman out of the boat and sent her to the hospital at the end of the race. Our kids jumped out of the boat and said, felt nothing, felt no pain, felt no fatigue. It was just so easy. They said to me, we think it came from the details, from the precision of the movement of 8 of us in the boat. And I think that makes a lot of sense, that everyone's going to the same place at the entry, everyone's going to the same place at the release. The precision of the movements and trying to get 8 people going to the same place each stroke. They said, that's what we think. The time that you spent on the simulation exercises are done in the winter without the oar. Now, years ago, I was at a national conference in Ottawa, and I had breakfast with a sports psychologist, and I told him about the simulation exercise. He got really excited, and he said that those exercises that you did with those athletes, they were really pump primers for visualization. That made some sense to me. Mm-hmm. And that was before we were talking, that was in the age before we were talking about visualization. But basically what I did with Hobart William Smith, they had 5 experiences. They had sneaking that meditation across. They had the quiet sitting. They had the concentration, the visualization, the relaxation, and the mindfulness. And those 5 exercises were periodized over the course of the year. So we would do different. We'd always do the quiet sitting, but we'd do some of these others we'd insert those into the mental training program. We had a mental training program that we followed, along with a physical program. And that's important. That's important. That's part of being a detailed coach. But the simulation exercises were done usually without the oar handle, whether on the erg or when I was at Yale, they were done in the rowing tanks without the oar handle. And they would just go through the whole stroke cycle. I would break the stroke cycle down in parts, and they had to do it together. So that, I think, is a big part of, I'm being asked by other people about flow, but I think that is a big part of how flow was achieved, especially by these women. 10 to 12 times in 6 years, phenomenal. It's just, now the same women, they extended the mental training, and there were 6 of them at this dinner in New York. And those 6 eventually got married and had babies. And they swore by the meditative training that they received in college as for getting them through the pregnancy and the delivery.
Yeah, it really helped them a lot.
It helped them a lot.
Yeah.
So the other important thing is that when they were doing their quiet sitting, I was doing their quiet sitting. I led them through the relaxation exercises. Visualizing. I mean, the coach has to be an integral part of it. He's got to be there. And I would sit in a circle with them when they were doing their meditation. He's got to lead. So here's this old 55-year-old sitting with these youngsters. That's really very important. You can't job this out. You've got to be there doing it with them, no matter what it is, whether it's the mindfulness, whether it's the concentration, the visualization, you have to be a part of it.
Now, Jim, would you do any of these 5 components for the mental training? Would that be before the actual physical portion of the training session, or was it after, or sometimes both?
Usually it was at the end.
Okay.
It's usually at the end. They would, sometimes I did it before they finished off running outside. And I remember they came to me and said, could we do it? Let's run outside first, where it's cold in the winter, and then come in and finish up with the mental training. And I said, fine, rather than go from the mental training and then outside, go from physical training indoors, then to mental training, and then more physical training of running hills or running for distance outside in the cold of Western New England. So I accommodate them, so I bring them in. Yeah, I would usually do it at the end.
Okay. And
for example, relaxation, that was done around exam time.
Right, because they were probably in a heightened stress state at that point.
That's right. Yeah. So I do the relaxation, and then they could go home and do their studying.
Right.
So it got them into a better state before I sent them home. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So some of the so that's a great example for relaxation. So visualization, would that be more kind of going through all of the elements of the rowing stroke, and then
that would do it. We'd do a lot of that, but then we'd also do some race simulation. So they'd do the visualization sitting as a group of 8 with the coxswain, sitting with, say, 2 or 3 crews together side by side where they had to concentrate on what their coxswain was saying. So that would be the visualization.
So would it almost be like a complete simulation of a 2,000 meter race from start to finish?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then, so the coxswain would make all the normal calls that they would make throughout the race.
And there'd be another crew right beside them doing the same thing. Right. But her group of 8 had to listen to her. So you're training them to ignore the noise beside them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And really be present and focus.
Present and focus, yeah. I found them, I would when we were on the water, I would go over something important in the stroke cycle that I wanted to focus on for the particular practice. I would give every coxswain or every single sculler a copy of the lesson plan for the day. They would have a written copy, and they would be very attentive, listening to me. They would then get on the boat and they'd be goofy going down to the dock, and they would launch the boat smartly, and then they were on. They were on. They were on sharp as tacks. They were concentrated for the whole practice.
Wow, that's great. So did you use the mental training with all your crews all the way through your coaching career?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. And how did you know what, because you gave the 5 kind of different ones: quiet sitting, concentration, mindfulness, relaxation, and visualization. So did each of those have a specific purpose or like value at certain times during a training session?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about, so you already mentioned relaxation and we talked about visualization for kind of race rehearsal. So how would you use concentration, mindfulness, and quiet sitting? What would be examples to use those?
Well, the quiet sitting would be the standard practice almost throughout the whole year. The mindfulness would come in towards the end where we were starting to race, and they had to be aware. For example, when they went to a race course and it was a new one, they had to be mindful of their time. They had to be mindful of where things were, where the bathrooms were. They had to be aware of race time, and then that also led into concentration. They had to be more concentrated because I was coaching both men and women, so I would have 4 crews. So I couldn't give them as much time. So they had to pick up on this and run their own show. So they were very much mindful of what was going on. For example, we were racing in Georgia, and it was in the late spring.
What year was this? Do you remember?
That was 1998.
Okay.
1998. And I went with the women. It was in the end of the year championships, and it was very warm. All the crews were sitting inside out of the heat. My crew was sitting outside before the race. All the crews were inside except William Smith. My crew's sitting outside. I went over to them and said, there's a cooler spot. There's air conditioning inside the building. And they looked at me and said, we have to race in 10 minutes in this. We have to race in this heat. We're getting used to this heat. They were being mindful. The other crews were sitting in comfort. But these little gals from this little school said, no, we're going to stay out here, coach, because this is what we have to race in soon. That was being mindful.
That's a great example. Yeah, preparing themselves for the moment to come.
That's right. It was a great example of how much they had learned over the years, and they could then apply it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're sharp. They were sharp. There's another dimension to all of this too. That's all that's all good academics, but their spirit was so high. They were just a very spirited group. And I think people ask me, how did you get them to have that much spirit? And I said, I don't know. I really don't know. It's just, I think I taught them to love the sport. And I taught them to really think in terms of this spirit. There's another dimension there, and that's how spirited you are. It didn't matter, how much weight they had lifted, how tall they were, how strong they were. There was something else that they had to bring out of themselves. And one of the things that I did every week, I would give them a reading. I wouldn't tell them why I gave them a particular reading, but I'd give them a reading, a page here, a page there. And a lot of it dealt with the spirit. And when they finished Hobart and William Smith, they would have a big binder of these readings. And a lot of it was, it'd be something from the Dalai Lama or someone else, or Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. There would be something that was serious that they had to consider. And I think that went a long way to building that spirit. And a lot of them were on spiritual writings.
Yeah. What made you think to include some of those influences that you mentioned? Was that just, were those books that you were reading at the time, or were those?
Yeah, there were books that I had. Yeah, there was books that I had reading at the time. One of the things I used to do for the Saratoga conference before, I would go through and I'd have a bag of books and encourage coaches to read this or read that, or none of them on the sport. None of them had anything to do with the sport direct. It was just my reading. Yeah. The other thing is that we tried to get them to have an appreciation for the environment. And that was important. So, yeah, that's about it, Joe.
No, it was great. That was fantastic. Did you want to talk about maybe, so this isn't a part of training that is probably, commonly practiced so much presently in present day.
That's right.
Right. So I guess the one is, why do you think that is? And two is, integrating this into training, how this can help some of the athletes in terms of their daily practices, but also their racing performances.
Well, it's part of our world now, Joe, that we have partly electronics, partly we're measuring everything. Mm-hmm. Numbers are important. And I think that for me, I'm looking out here and I can see some beautiful trees. And I was out earlier doing a walk and looking around. And we have a nature center across the street. It's 150 acres. It's beautiful. It's got all these different animals in it. And I can do my walk in there. I think that's important. But more and more, I'm feeling like a dinosaur. I'm just not in touch with what people normally think and talk about. I think that this is hurting us in the sporting world because they're not getting this detailed coaching. They're relying too much on power, and this is happening in all sports. Football in particular, but football has some small people playing.
And I think it was interesting you mentioned too about the relying so much on technology and the data aspect. You're not sort of developing that natural intuition of being an athlete. You're kind of relying too much on technology.
I think so. I think it's missing, and it means that through my career, I saw athletes who were not concerned. One or two were, and not big guys. They weren't concerned about how much they lifted, but they lifted properly. Mm-hmm. They lifted properly. When we went with the women, because of the stroke that I described, they needed a strong upper shoulder girdle. So we did a special exercise to develop that shoulder girdle strength in the women. We basically did a clean from a standing position on a bench. So we went below the bench, the level of the bench, and then did the clean, which really developed their shoulder girdle.
Wow.
But when they lifted, it was really stressed, and I watched them. Between the two groups, they were doing 18 practices a week. Well, I was there for the 18 practices, and when they lifted, I was there. So they had to do the exercise properly. And watching this athlete, he was doing it properly. He wasn't lifting as much. Then when it came to the erg, he had one of the best erg scores. Mm-hmm. He was able to transfer that strength to the erg. I think it's important, Joe.
Yeah, and just it kind of comes back to what you said earlier about all the details, like really focusing on the nuances of the movement rather than how much repetitions or weight.
That's right. You really have to. The simulation exercises were good for that. I had the Hobart kids here. They brought me back to coach about 4 or 5 years ago. So they were going to England, and there was a kid rowing in the bow, and his knee was splayed too wide. And I made a comment, and then I watched the race on television. His leg was in; it wasn't splayed. He had taken that lesson and he had applied it, and he applied it in the race at English Henley.
Wow, that's great.
That's the detail.
Right.
Yeah, because if it's splayed too wide, he can't get the power out of that leg. He's got to bring the leg in before he can really get the power out of it.
Yeah, you have to have the proper alignment.
You have to have the alignment. The alignment is so critical. So it's really, it came to me at a fairly young age. I appreciated the dancer. The dancer has the alignment, and we're losing that. We're losing that, Joel.
Yeah. Do you think there's too much of an emphasis on speed and power from not just rowing, but all sports, kind of those characteristics versus, the natural intuition and being a racer and being smooth and fluid and working on all the skills.
Yeah. Well, I remember the great John Landry from Australia was a wonderful technician, great runner. Herb Elliott was the same way. They were good technicians. Back in the 1960s, they were great role models. Gordie Howe, the same thing. At 6'3" and 190 pounds, he was smooth. He was a smooth athlete. So you remember those things. Bob Pierce beat both Landry and Elliott out for the award. Yeah, it's an amazing thing. They reached back and they remembered that Pierce was so good as an athlete.
Right.
He was a big man and he was smooth. He had smooth movements. And I think the dancer is being an inspiration to me. They made a great movie, Gene Kelly did, Dancing as a Man's Game, where he took Mickey Mantle and he took Vic Seixas, the tennis player. I'm trying to think, I've forgotten the different athletes, and showed how they were doing dance movements in their sport.
Very cool.
Yeah, dancing is a man's game.
So what do you think we need to do in present day sport to kind of get back to some of these elements that you're talking about?
I think in large part, like I said, I didn't have a sports psychologist. I think sports psychology has a huge role to play in this area, where you look at the person in totality and you can see all the different dimensions. The person comes as a student, or he comes as a worker. You see the person in their totality, not just in their sport, but in life. And I think that you, Joe DeLeo, have a big role to play and responsibility to play in this, where you get beyond the academics and this number crunching.
Well,
I think the sports psychologist has a big role to play.
Well, thank you, and that's a big pair of shoes to fill. So hopefully, I'll continue to do a good job and keep working on that for the rest of my career.
I think so. I think it's you can see, like, what we're dealing with here is the mind.
Yes.
And when I go to my cushion just next to me here every morning, I'm trying to develop that stillness and silence in my mind. I'm trying to go deeper into my mind. And that's what we have to do with our athletes. And that really is the counter. Like, it's mindless what some of people are doing. They're just because of all the counting and not developing, not looking at the person and say, well, how can I develop their mind, their whole mind?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there a specific example you can think back in your coaching career that you thought was particularly helpful in developing the athlete's mind, or that an athlete said to you, like, gave you feedback and said it was very helpful?
The old coach that I had, he would send before we did a piece, he'd say, sit quietly, just sit quietly for a couple of minutes before you do the piece. He would do other exercises that tied in the mind. And he cited Newt Rockne, he was that era. Newt Rockne, he'd cite this, that Newt Rockne thought sport was 99% mental. Didn't have sports psychologists in those days.
Right.
But they came in, like we were talking, what were we talking about? I know a coach got all excited because this was 1978. And, well, I wrote a piece in 1978 on the art of sculling, and I was talking about some of the psychology, and he got all excited because he had been to a conference in Toronto where they were talking about this that's the first time he heard it. He was a national coach here in the United States. He was an Olympic coach here in the United States. He had won a gold medal with his crew in 1964 Olympics, and he got all excited about this.
Wow.
And that was, what I was writing about in the art of sculling went back to the late 50s and early 60s, where Fitzpatrick was working with me. I don't know. I'm trying to think in the stroke cycle where he would do things that would affect the mind. And I can't think of them. I can't. But there were things. There were exercises that he did that affect. One of the things he did, he was not welcomed at the St. Catharines Rowing Club. So he couldn't go out on a launch with me. So he would stand on the bank, and then I would go over to him, and then he would take me through. There would be about seven things that I had to work on. And that developed my mind where I could multitask.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
I had to remember all those items that he said. And then I'd go up the course and work on it.
Did you focus on one thing at a time? Or
I did.
Progress? Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. You don't do. That's the only way you can.
That's right.
You can't. There's no such thing as multitasking.
That's right. That's right. Focus. You
got to focus. Yeah, you have to focus. Well, the thing he did, we did these speed drills where you took 20 strokes, and you did 20 strokes and go and what you had, and then you did them 3 times, and you had to monitor what every stroke, the quality of the stroke. So as you were doing it, and you had to do them quick, there are 20 strokes high, so 40 strokes per minute, and you had to monitor the quality of each stroke. How
would you do that? How would you monitor the quality?
Well, it's mindfulness and just being mindful. That's what I wanted to give you an example. You had to be mindful of what was happening with each stroke, whether it was rough or not clean, or you had to concentrate. And then when you were finished, you go back through it and say, well, the 5th stroke wasn't good, or the 7th stroke wasn't good.
So for that exercise, it would be more about focusing on the quality of each stroke in that set of 20 versus.
As you were doing them at a speed, a high racing speed, you had to monitor those strokes, right, and then store it away so that you knew what happened on the 5th stroke and on the 10th stroke. Mm-hmm. It was phenomenal. I was concentrating so hard one day that I ran into, you had to go into a slip, and at the end of the slip, I hit the bulkhead that went across. There was about 20 feet there sticking out. I hit the bulkhead dead on, never did any damage to my shell, just shook the hell out of me. Because all of a sudden, you hit it at 20 high strokes per minute. You hit that thing. It just shook, went right through my body. I didn't go out of the boat. I stayed in the boat.
That's impressive. You just stopped dead, stop right. Wow.
You stopped dead at maximum speed.
Wow. Oof. You were in the zone right there.
Oh, I was in it.
Yeah.
I was in it.
So Jim, is there anything else that you want to touch on in regards to flow? Any other points that you think are to kind of summarize or you think are important for people?
I can't think of anything else. I'm just I'm in a period now. You're asking me, sport, energy, and consciousness people. Dave Megacy is asking me, and I just have to draw this out. Just how I think that some people are approaching it too academically, and so I gave you the examples of the coaching really helping, and the precision of the athlete is really what's created the flow. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I got to think of some other things. I'm not there yet. I'm just not there. Just what else would help the development? But I think, I think the meditation helps. I think sitting and trying to develop stillness of the mind or getting rid of your monkey mind. Like my monkey mind is gone now when I sit. I mean, I'm not thinking about anything. So I think that really helps the flow.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, quieting the mind.
Quieting the mind. And too many people, there's too much talking and not enough doing. And I see that all around me. So just quieting the mind and being still and silent is so important. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a big challenge in today's world with smartphones and computers, and
it's tough
to disconnect and unplug.
Yeah. I mean, when I was at Hobart, I almost got a phone because I wanted to be able to quickly take pictures of the crews, and then I got looking at what people are doing on the texting, and I just don't want to join that world.
Yeah,
I don't. That's why we had trouble today, Joe. Is that I'm not sure how this works. You're the one that got it to work,
right.
But so it's when you're looking at an 80-year-old dinosaur. I mean, the sport was different, but I would do much the same I would do today, and I did it 2 years ago with the Hobart crew. I would do all the things that I talked about. I did with them with the simulation exercises, the quiet sitting. I got them down on the floor. I did all of that with them. That was 2 years ago. And I would do that again. Those things work to get the quality out of the movement. That's the thing you're trying to really ultimately do, is get quality in the movement. And then that will override some of the more powerful athletes.
Right.
If you can get, and they did that. They finished 16th in the national championships with the big crews. 16th in 2015 at the IRA. They did a hell of a job, but they had good movements, right. And people said, "Oh, they're a sharp-looking little crew." They were little compared to the people like Washington and Yale and California. They were small. Yeah.
Right. That was great. That was fantastic. Some really good points, I think, that people can take and fold into their own training and think about using on and off the water to help them prepare for the training sessions and racing performances.
Yeah, I mean, if I can get through to them this whole business of the smooth motion, that really helps. That will overcome size, and that'll overcome power. it'll go a long ways toward it. But they have to believe in it.
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me is I remember watching the men's double race from the 2004 Athens Olympics, and that French double won that race. Yeah. And they were, if you looked at them physically, even just during the race, they were not big at all. But they had that boat just constantly ran out. There was no slowing down, and it didn't sink down into the water. It was just horizontal the entire time. Really nice.
They had been well taught. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had been well taught. Yep. I was looking at another French crew at double again, and I think they were women, and they were doing the same thing. This past year at the World Championships. They were very impressive. Okay.
Cool. Well, Jim, let me just wrap up the call, and I'll give you a proper goodbye off air.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.